Hello, my name's Rick Sheffer. I would like to share some insights I gained regarding the Naval Air War in Vietnam during my tour of duty in 1968. I entered the Naval Aviation Officers Candidate School, Pensacola, Florida, on November 1, 1968. After 11 weeks of officers training, I was commissioned ensign and reported to Naval Flight School. For the next 7 months, I went through the extensive flight training, including land and sea survival school and solo flights in both the T-34 and T-28 trainers. I dropped on request from the flight program a month after a rather frightening solo flight. The Navy then sent me to communication school in San Diego prior to reporting to my next duty station on CTF-77 staff, Tonkin Gulf, Vietnam. CTF-77 is the abbreviation for Commander Task Force 77. At that time, the commander of the task force was Admiral Ralph Cozzens, a 2- and later a 3-star admiral in charge of the Naval Air War in Vietnam. Besides duty as a communications watch officer, I was also assigned the duties of Assistant Strike Operations Officer. The Admiral's staff consisted of approximately 40 officers and enlisted personnel. I was one of 5 communications watch officers on the staff. As a communications watch officer, my duties were primarily routing message traffic to the appropriate staff members as well as coordinating communications with the ship's comm center. I was also the crypto officer, responsible for top secret codes and decrypting top secret messages for the staff. As Assistant Strike Operations Officer, I plotted daily strike operations on a map for my boss to use to brief the Admiral. I also kept the log on downed Navy pilots, presumed dead, captured, or rescued. There were over 500 pilots listed in the log when I left the staff a year later. Admiral Ralph Cozzens was the commander of Task Force 77, which was permanently deployed at sea and physically located on the USS Kitty Hawk aircraft carrier when I reported for duty. The staff, 6 months on the Kitty Hawk, then packed up their gear and moved on to the USS Constellation, where we spent the next 6 months. Because we physically spent 1 full year at sea, our tour of duty was considered arduous sea duty. And because we operated in the war zone, we received supplemental combat pay. Here is how the staff presented itself in a stateside newspaper article. From a position known as Yankee Station in the Tonkin Gulf, one of the most powerful sea forces ever assembled is actively pursuing the U.S. Navy's campaign of interdiction, halting the flow of material from North Vietnam to enemy forces in the south. Task Force 77, the 7th Fleet's attack carrier striking force, is an armada of 5 aircraft carriers, 3 of which are on the line constantly, 400 planes, some 25 support ships, and more than 30,000 men. Pilots of the task force conducted around-the-clock airstrikes in North Vietnam, concentrating on choke points where rail, highways, and waterways connected, and transshipment points where supplies were stockpiled to be infiltrated through the DMZ. The destruction of trucks and barges robbed the enemy units in the Republic of Vietnam of millions of pounds of equipment and has significantly reduced their ability to wage major campaigns. While aircraft are hitting inland targets, the task force surface arm, the cruisers, frigates, destroyers, and battleship were prowling the North Vietnamese coastal waters, foiling attempts to infiltrate by sea and pumping tons of ordnance into shore battery positions and coastal supply routes. At the same time, other support ships were performing the equally important job of protecting the task force against aerial, surface, and subsurface attacks, and teaming with helicopters to carry search and rescue operations for pilots downed off the coast. Three aircraft carriers continually orbited a latitude-longitude point in the Gulf of Tonkin called Yankee Station, while the remaining two carriers were somewhere at or between port calls. Day and night air operations were conducted between the three carriers on station. Each carrier had 5 or 6 air squadrons comprised of 90 attack, fighter, tanker, reconnaissance aircraft, radar planes, and helicopters. The Air Wing Strike Force included 5 attack aircraft types. They were the A-1 Sky Raider, the A-3 Sky Warrior, A-4 Sky Hawk, A-5 Vigilante, the A-6 Intruder, and the A-7 Corsair. In addition to the attack aircraft, the Air Wing included the following: the F-4 Phantom, the F-8 Crusader, which were both fighter aircraft, the E-1 Tracker, the E-2 Skyhawk radar control aircraft, and rescue helicopters. The USS Kitty Hawk had a naval complement of almost 5,000 individuals. It was a city at sea that included round-the-clock food preparation and serving facilities, tailors, laundries, snack bars, dental, medical facilities, as well as all the support services required to keep a city ship afloat. Staff departments included personnel, ordnance, operation, strike operations, fleet operations, communications, electronic warfare, supply and replenishment, communications, and planning. Every morning around 9 a.m., the senior staff members gathered in the command center and briefed the Admiral on the war activities that occurred over the past 24 hours. Each department head stood before the Admiral and staff members with a pointer and maps and briefed them on the areas of responsibility. Frequently, the Admiral briefed visiting senators and congressmen on the status of the war. These dignitaries were heady briefings for a young junior officer like me to observe. We heard the Admiral on numerous occasions brief these Senate dignitaries on the 3 objectives of the war in the North. These were: 1. To interdict the flow of war goods into South Vietnam; 2. To destroy the North's ability to fight the air war; and 3. To bring the war home to Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese people. 24 hours a day, 3 staff officers stood watch over the war activities within the Admiral's control. The watch included 2 senior officers and 1 communications watch officer. Watches were usually 4 hours in duration, which meant every 24 hours you stood 8 hours of watch, day or night, plus your secondary duties. The air war in the North was codenamed Rolling Thunder. For military planning purposes, North Vietnam was divided into 6 segments called route packages, or route packs for short. Rules of engagement were defined so as to give both the Air Force and the Navy access to lucrative targets in the North, which were the 3 major industrial cities in the North: Hanoi, Haiphong, and Vinh. These 3 cities made up what was called the Iron Triangle, because this area was loaded with AAA and SAM missile sites. They claimed more anti-aircraft guns were located in this land area than comparable area anywhere in World War II. The Air Force bombed the Hanoi area via flight routes overland and from bases in South Vietnam and Thailand. The Navy bombed the Hanoi and Haiphong area from sea. Strict coordination between the Air Force and Navy was required in order to avoid air collisions during normal times, and particularly during Joint Command Alpha strikes. For instance, our rules of engagement stated if there was a Russian or Soviet bloc ship in Haiphong Harbor, no bombing runs could be made anywhere near the ship. The North naturally figured this out and always kept 1 ship in port at all times. In operations in November and December of 1967 included Alpha strikes in the north to interdiction strikes in the southern part of North Vietnam, to close air support in South Vietnam. An Alpha Strike was an all-out attack on a single strategic military target, such as a major train bridge over a river. The Admiral's staff, in conjunction with the 7th Air Force Command, defined the authorized strike targets, and each carrier on station was directed to conduct certain operations with specific time-over-target assignments. Writing a detailed operations order for a Navy carrier airstrike has been described as composing a symphony for an orchestra the size of the New York Philharmonic. But planning one for a major night strike to be flown simultaneously from 3 carriers, coordinated with simultaneous attacks by the 7th Air Force, was like composing a symphony for 2 or 3 orchestras that would have to perform it together without rehearsing. One or more fighter squadrons would be assigned bar cap duty, or barrier cap, which provided air cover for the carriers and support ships from attack by the enemy, while other fighter squadrons were assigned air cover protection over the attacking aircraft. Certain dedicated aircraft provided electronic coordination for the attack. Other aircraft provided bomb damage assessment following the air attack. When an Alpha Strike was launched, a choreographed effort went into effect. First, the rescue helicopters and the bar-capped aircraft took off to pick up any downed pilots and to protect the fleet from air attack, respectively. Second, the refueling tankers took off and orbited the carriers, ready to refuel each attacked aircraft immediately after takeoff. This permitted the attack aircraft to take off with minimum fuel but deliver a maximum bomb load to the target. Next, the electronic aircraft took off and assumed their station as the air controllers for the attack. These aircraft were the electronic eyes and ears of the effort. They guided each aircraft feet wet and feet dry of the operation. Their electronic monitoring and communications were transmitted directly to each carrier's Combat Intelligence Center for operational coordination and updates. The attack aircraft hit the targets in coordinated waves. First, anti-personnel bombs were dropped on any aircraft and surface-to-air missile sites. Anti-aircraft guns were vicious over these high-value targets, as well as were the surface-to-air missiles. These devices consisted of anti-personnel bomblets encased within a bomb canister. The canister blows open, low over the ground, spraying a number of bomblets that each explode and spray ball-bearing-like shrapnel over the site. These flights were meant to take the heat off the attacking aircraft. Next, the attack aircraft hit the target, dropping their ordnance at low altitude on the target. Wave after wave of aircraft dropped 250-pound, 500-pound, and 1,000-pound bombs on the intended target, or they would fire guided missiles into the target. When the last attack plane passed through the target, the reconnaissance plane flew low altitude over the target, taking pictures for bomb damage assessment. These poor buggers took one hell of a beating, since the North Vietnamese quickly defined the American attack order of battle. One time, the RA-5 recon aircraft was late flying over a target, and not one gun or missile was fired at them. After that, the time over target for recon planes varied, but the Vietnamese adjusted their tactics accordingly. In early January 1968, the North Vietnamese launched the famous TET Offensive on South Vietnam with a massive all-out attack throughout the country. The Marine base camp in the highlands at Quai Son was a major focus of North Vietnam's offensive, as was the ancient capital city of Hue. Hundreds of carrier attack flights were diverted to support the Marine base, as well as supporting ground troops throughout South Vietnam. Day after day, the battle waged. President Johnson feared this would be America's Dien Bien Phu, the battle that defeated the French in their Indochina War. Air Force and the Navy provided support to the troops on the ground in South Vietnam. Frequently, when a major attack was launched in the South, naval aircraft would be diverted in their support. This was also true of downed pilots, where aircraft would stay on station as long as fuel held out. One of the most valuable close air support aircraft of the war was the A-1 Douglas Sky Raider, a World War II single-seat, piston-driven propeller aircraft that could stay over the target for hours, providing close air support to the troops. The last Sky Raider ended carrier service off the Constellation during my tour of duty in 1968. Late that January, the North Korean military attacked and boarded a U.S. intelligence ship, the USS Pueblo, which is operating in the Sea of Japan off the coast of North Korea. Captain Butcher and crew were taken prisoner and the ship towed into a North Korean port. This was an act of war against the U.S., and ship movements responded immediately. The USS Enterprise was dispatched to the Sea of Japan. Our carrier, the Kitty Hawk, spent over 60 consecutive days online during this period. The ship won the Presidential Unit Citation for this time period in the war zone. However, the crew of the Pueblo was held captive for 11 months before being released. The Air Force used saturation bombing from B52 aircraft in support of the troops at Khe Sanh. During the battle, a massive aerial bombardment campaign, Operation Niagara, was launched by the U.S. Air Force to support the Marine base. Over 100,000 tons of bombs, equivalent in destruction force to 5 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs, were dropped until mid-April by aircraft of the U.S. Air Force, Navy, and Marines onto the surrounding area of Khe Sanh. A major strategy of the Vietnam War was the interdiction of war goods from north to the south. The North Vietnamese moved their war supplies into South Vietnam by convoys of trucks, carts, or bicycles. Supplies would be offloaded from trains, trucks, or boats at specified truck stops. These truck stops were usually located on the side of the many rivers and canals in the country. If there had been a bridge over the river or canal, it had since been bombed away by our aircraft. Sometimes the North would build a steel bridge a foot or so underwater so that it would appear that there was no bridge there. When we spotted a truck seemingly riding on water, we went back in and bombed it away. Otherwise, they would offload the goods onto barges that would cross the river where the goods were loaded onto waiting trucks for movement further south. One of the jobs I was given as Assistant Strike Operations Officer was keeping track of the Mark 36 mines that were used in the seeding program, as this operation was called. The Mark 36 was in effect a 250-pound bomb with a special detonator device, a task that was magnetically actuated. Pilots would fly in and drop 30 or 40 seeds in the interdiction waterway or road. The bomb would bury themselves into the waterway or land, waiting for a metal object to come by to set them off. The tactic worked beautifully at first. When the barge crossed over the mine, it clicked the magnetic detonator and exploded, destroying the barge and supplies. We thought this was great, and it would end the supplying of the South. But the enemy sure wasn't that stupid. They soon figured out that these seeds were triggered by a magnetic device. So countermeasures, after the bombs were dropped, they would float some metal barrels down the canal to set off the bombs and then continue about their work. When we figured this out, we installed a random click detonator where each bomb, when armed, required a random number of magnetic clicks to set it off. Now the bad guys were not sure how many times they had to float barrels before it was safe. But this didn't stop them, but it did slow them up quite a bit. The most notorious methods for moving war goods from the north to the south was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was a logistical system that ran through North Vietnam and the kingdoms of Laos and Cambodia. It ran for hundreds of miles through rugged mountains, 1,500 to 8,000 feet high, triple canopy jungle, and dense primeval forests. Theoretically, We were not allowed to cross over into Laos and Cambodia, but we did without reservation looking for targets of opportunity, such as troop or truck movements on the trail. Bombing raids in this area were codenamed Operation Barrel Roll and Tiger Hound. The rules of engagement, as defined from Washington, placed straitjackets on the execution of the war. One such rule had to do with attacking surface-to-air missile sites in North Vietnam. Our pilots were not allowed to attack SAM sites unless their radar lit up one of our planes in anticipation of a launch, and then we could attack them. The North used this to their advantage by building the SAM sites without fear of attack until they lit up and went after us. This rule cost us a lot of pilots who were killed or spent time in a POW camp. Another rule of engagement stated that our aircraft could not attack any enemy aircraft if the planes were on the ground. Again, it had to do with fear that we would kill Russian pilots on the ground or something like that. Therefore, the North would keep fighters on the runway ready for takeoff, safe from harm, until they actually took off and attacked one of our planes. Shown here is the Kep airfield north of Hanoi. One day while I was standing watch, an emergency landing was announced over the loudspeaker. An RA-5 reconnaissance aircraft had gotten shot up on a mission up north. The pilot reported that he only had enough fuel for one landing pass on the carrier, and therefore as a precaution, the ship rigged a nylon barrier across the flight deck. The plane landed and was caught by the barrier. The only damage done to the plane was slight damage to the horizontal stabilizer. Combat search and rescue was a mission primarily performed using helicopters that operated in very hostile territory, at night and in bad weather. The Navy went to unprecedented steps to attempt to rescue downed pilots. If a pilot could parachute over water, the chance of rescue were pretty good. Over land was a much different proposition. Every 3 or 4 days, the ship would undergo underway replenishment. A grocery ship, a munition ship, or an oiler would pull alongside the carrier. Lines would be shot across to the carrier where cables were attached, and then supplies would be transferred over to the aircraft carrier. This was a tricky maneuver, for it required steaming and perfect formation during the operation. The aircraft carrier was a city at sea, with the complete hotel facilities for feeding and sleeping the pilots and ship's company. The ship had a complete dental office, operating rooms, sick bay beds, machine shop, radio shop, laundry. Every evening a movie was shown in the Admiral's mess. I remember seeing the movie Cool Hand Luke with Paul Newman, and everyone kept repeating for days the famous lines, "What we have here is a failure to communicate," or the other line was, "My boy can eat 50 eggs." Famous lines from the movie. Mail was delivered each day via the COD, or Carrier Onboard Delivery Aircraft, dispatched from Subic Bay, Philippines. Our mail went out free of charge, no postage needed, and it took only about 5 days to and from its destination in the States. My mother couldn't believe how quick mail was delivered, and several times she mailed me cookies packed in popcorn, and the popcorn was still fresh when it arrived. The Navy went out of its way to support mail service from the combat zone. Junior staff officers ate in the pilot's wardroom, which was open 24 hours a day. On the other hand, the Admiral's wardroom was very upscale with formal dining for the senior staff officers. The Admiral had his own staff chef, a senior Filipino petty officer, plus his Filipino staff. I ate in the Admiral's mess 3 times during my year's tour of duty in Southeast Asia. In 1967 for Christmas dinner, on my birthday on January 12, and when I was promoted to lieutenant junior grade from ensign. The Christmas meal was unbelievable. The meal featured a roast pig served totally intact with an apple in its mouth. Desserts were terrific too. The Admiral actually published a cookbook with recipes of major dishes and made copies available for all the staff. Flight operations usually ran 16 hours with an 8-hour stand-down period. During these times, Chris Cook, another CWO, and I would run 2 miles day or night on the flight deck. At night, the sky would be pitch black, a 20-knot breeze blowing over the ship, and the flight deck bobbing up and down. We were careful negotiating on the deck, making sure we never ventured too close to the edge. No man overboard for us. Life in the carrier was not all launch and recovery of aircraft. Each aircraft carrier spent 30 to 45 days on Yankee Station and in transport to and from Liberty Call. Our primary port of call was Subic Bay, Philippines, and Olongapo City, which was a wide open town where there were plenty of bar girls to go around. Twice during my year's tour, we pulled Liberty in Japan. It took 4 days steaming day and night to make Japan, so we usually spent 6 to 7 days in port there. On one visit there, we were approached by a Japanese businessman who offered to take us to several tourist areas not normally accessible to tourists. At first we were skeptical, but he explained he was part of a business organization that seeks out Americans for goodwill who may, in the future, be in responsible positions. He took us to the Tokyo Needle and a Japanese wedding house. In Japan, I bought a complete Sansui stereo system and a Canon camera, both at very good prices. Hong Kong and the Philippines took 2 to 3 days, and Liberty lasted approximately 5 days. There we visited the junks in Aberdeen, as well as shopping and general sightseeing. This was the time Hong Kong was a British colony in the mainland of communist China. I bought custom-made suits and shoes at very good prices here also. The evening of March 31, 1968, we had 3 senior admirals in the command center with our staff waiting for a special message from Washington. These 3 were the most senior admirals directly responsible for running the Navy's air war in Vietnam. The message came in from Washington, where President Johnson, in order to induce the North to negotiate a peace agreement, declared a partial bombing halt, which would restrict all bombing of North Vietnam north of the 20th parallel. This left only the southernmost part of North Vietnam and all of South Vietnam and the Ho Chi Minh Trail for military air action. In addition to the bombing halt announcement, President Johnson dropped a second unexpected verbal bomb when he announced that he would not run for re-election for President of the United States. He did this partially as an overture to the North, hoping it would lead to peace. But also, he was being badly beaten up politically back in the home front. One of the last significant events that happened during my time in CTF 77 staff occurred on November 1, just before I was to catch a flight off the carrier and back to the States. Back channels alerted the Admiral that President Johnson was going to call a complete bombing halt of North Vietnam. Again, these 3 admirals came aboard our carrier to await the orders from Washington. This was another step President Johnson took trying to induce the North to the peace table. In the middle of November, I boarded the day's Cod flight and flew off the carrier to Subic Bay, where I took the bus to Clark Airfield and finally a military flight to San Francisco. I was home. During my year tour of duty in Vietnam, I took home movies with my 8mm camera. Edited versions of these movies are also posted on my YouTube channel for viewing. The Vietnam War came to an end for me, but much had changed since I left the States a year earlier. America had gone through tremendous turmoil during this time. The year 1968 was ground zero for the seismic cultural shift in America as the following events fermented and boiled out of cities and college campuses. I was returning to a country far different than when I had left, and I wasn't sure what I would find. I think it would be appropriate as a conclusion to my presentation to review briefly the events that transpired in my absence. The events in Southeast Asia were causing festering in the cities and colleges' campuses back home, turning young people against the war. The Pentagon announced the 10th U.S. airplane lost over Vietnam in January of that year. North Korea patrol boats captured the USS Pueblo. Offensive was launched all over South Vietnam. American photographer Eddie Adams captured the now famous picture of a South Vietnamese general executing a Vietnam prisoner. The U.S. State Department announces the highest U.S. casualty toll of the Vietnam War. The previous week saw 543 Americans killed in action and 2,547 wounded. The nation's #1 television newsman reports that the war in Vietnam is unwinnable. And in the New Hampshire primary election, Eugene McCarthy, the anti-war presidential candidate, comes within 230 votes of defeating the sitting president, Lyndon Johnson. Robert Kennedy announces that he will enter the 1968 presidential race, also with an eye on ending the war early. President Johnson announces a partial bombing halt of North Vietnam and reporting his decision not to seek re-election. Dr. King is assassinated in Memphis, which sparks rioting in Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, Detroit, Kansas City, Newark, Washington, D.C., and many other U.S. cities, resulting in 46 deaths blamed on the riots. Secretary of Defense Clark Clifford calls 24,500 military reserves to action for 2-year commitments and announces a new troop ceiling of 549,500 American soldiers in Vietnam. Students occupy Columbia University's Law Administration office, culminating 7 days later when the police storm the building and violently remove the students. The Soviet Union invades Czechoslovakia with over 200,000 Warsaw Pact troops, putting an end to this Prague Spring. Robert Kennedy wins California primary, and while addressing a large crowd of supporters at the Ambassador Hotel in San Francisco, is shot by Sirhan Sirhan. Women's liberation groups demonstrated the Miss America Beauty Contest in Atlantic City, protesting traditional roles of women. National Turn In Your Draft Card Day is observed with rallies and protests on college campuses throughout the country. The Summer Olympic Games open in Mexico City. The Games are boycotted by 32 African nations in protest of South Africa's participation. And black athletes disrupt the Games by performing the Black Power salute during the Star-Spangled Banner at their medal ceremony. And Nixon is elected President of the United States with a mere 0.7% margin of the total vote. And the year 1968 ended with the circumnavigation of the moon on New Year's Eve by the American Apollo 8 mission. Imagine that. We orbited the moon. Upon returning home for leave, I found an old World War II card that my dad bought with a drawer full of cards when the local drugstore closed. It was a cartoon of Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo. As a joke, I wrote in the card, "I sure feel better about the war with you over there and me over here," and sent it to my junior officer buddies still on the staff. They in turn shared it with some of the senior staff officers, who in turn shared it with the Chief of Staff, who shared it with the Admiral. The Admiral had a good sense of humor and posted it on the staff bulletin board for all to see. Later, when I reported to my duty station, with an anti-submarine warfare staff at Moffett Field, California, I was told to report to the Admiral. I was awarded the Navy Achievement Medal for my service in Vietnam. I was surprised to receive the award, but very proud nonetheless. Exactly 1 year later, I was honorably discharged from the U.S. Navy and returned to my hometown in Pennsylvania. Well, folks, that's my story of the Navy's Air War Strategy, Vietnam. I want to thank you for your kind patience and attendance.